So thank you everybody for joining us today to hear from Darcy. I also wanted to welcome all our external guests. So we've got quite a few externals online today. So what we normally do is we'll run through the seminar. People can feel free to come off mute in question time and ask their questions, but also feel free just to chuck them in the chat function if you feel more comfortable doing that, and we can go through them that way. For those of you that don't know Darcy, Darcy is a behavioural scientist and PhD candidate who has been associated with CSIRO since his internship in 2021. Since then, he's provided research assistance across 2 research units and 4 future science platforms. He's currently part of the interdisciplinary decision-making theme of the AEB, or Advanced Engineering Biology FSP, and his project's also co-funded by the Immune Resilience FSP. Today we'll be hearing more about his PhD research, which is focused on the psychological factors underlying public acceptance and rejection of animal biotechnology. So it's a little bit different from what we normally hear about here. So instead of hearing about the wet lab work that we normally do, we can hear about the factors that influence the public attitudes to some of the work we do. You've probably previously heard people present on the social acceptance around biotechnology for human applications, but their attitudes towards biotechnology when it comes to animals, especially those going to enter the food chain, can be very different. So I'm very interested to hear what you found so far, Darcy. Over to you.
No worries. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for having me here. So over the 3 years that I've been studying the psychological basis of attitudes towards biotechnology, I've found a lot of really interesting things, and I'm going to try and share them all with you today, with a focus on animal biotechnology. Because there's a huge variety of people in the audience, just so that everyone's on the same page regarding biotechnology, I mean it to mean the application of engineering principles to living systems to create some product or service, because I'll be using that word a lot and I want to make sure that everyone knows what it means. There are probably people here that know it much better than me. But anyway, the way that I've structured this presentation is in 4 major sections. So to begin with, I'll talk just sort of about the background regarding the general public acceptability of biotechnology, why it's important to study why I think that it's important to study the acceptability of biotechnology, and then the literature review that I was originally commissioned to do by the Synthetic Biology FSP, which later became the AB FSP, and the results of that review, which will be the general acceptable, the factors that are generally the case when it comes to people considering biotechnology. I'll then go specifically into animal applications, and the reason for taking a bit of a run-up is because a lot of the general reasoning mechanisms that are apparent in other areas of biotechnology perception, like in health or conservation, are also appropriate to animal biotechnology, but I will make a specific consideration towards animal biotechnology. I'll also do a little bit of a deep dive in that section to some of the more mysterious reasoning mechanisms, because they're highlighted by animal applications. And then finally, I'll go over some early results from my research, which will be looking into the acceptability of livestock mRNA vaccines, as well as a few other biotechnologies. But that's the overview, so I'll start with the background. So the first genetically modified crop to be commercialized was in 1994. It was flavor saver tomatoes. And 21 years after the commercialization of this crop, the Pew Research Institute in America conducted this representative sample of attitudes towards GM food safety. And it found that most people considered them to be unsafe to eat, which starkly contrasted the number of scientists that believed that they were safe. Now, there had been a lot of controversy around genetic modification by this time, but there was nothing to suggest that they were dangerous or unsafe, which is what this study found. Fast forward about 9 years to last year, and the Elderman Trust Barometer found that globally, attitudes towards genetically modified food remain negative. And this is despite their ubiquitous usage all over the world, and still the absence of anything that would suggest that they're dangerous. I can't say that they're not controversial, but I can say that they're not dangerous. But interestingly, genetic medicine, another form of biotechnology, is viewed much more favorably by comparison. And it's the first of many indicators that it is not the principle of using biotechnology to solve one of the world's problems, but how and why biotechnology is used to do it that determines public attitudes towards it. And it's important to study that because if you can understand the basis for existing objections and acceptance of biotechnology, you can predict individual responsiveness towards new and emerging biotechnologies. And with recent advances, there are a whole lot of new ones on the horizon. So sort of understanding the lie of the land, I guess, makes it easier to understand how new biotech will be anticipated and ultimately so that it's adopted a little easier. So just when I keep saying biotechnology, I'll unpack it a little bit. This is a chart from the ICOLA report a couple of years back looking at biotechnology. These are different methods of applying engineering principles to living things to modify them in some way. And they range in complexity, and depending on the level of complexity sort of determines which discipline they fall under. A bit of a spoiler warning is that the public tends to just view genetic modification of any kind as genetic modification. If you're modifying genes, you're modifying genes. But the reason that I show this slide is to highlight these 5 techniques because they appear a lot in the literature. And when I first began my search, I started by looking at whether or not these techniques had been reviewed because they're some of the most common. So this won't be on the test, and there's probably people here that understand these much better than me. I'm a humble behavioral scientist. But you have the deletion of genes, or just the minor modifications thereof, the transfer of genetic material from sexually compatible species or the same species to, the same species. So these 3, you can kind of create products or modifications that could otherwise exist without human intervention. And then there's transgenics, which is where you transfer the DNA of like a foreign DNA from different species or even different kingdoms. So you create different products or animal modifications or human modifications or plant modifications mostly that couldn't otherwise exist in nature. That will be important later. Just a little bit of light foreshadowing. But anyway, this is the literature review as it stands today. Most of this research was conducted in 2022, but over the years, I've just been adding studies to it as more have been released. We're at 57 papers now, mostly independent research. Most of the world's countries are represented in the sample. And we've got well over 250,000 participants total. I have this plus here because some studies were a bit vague about how many people were in them, and the reviews sometimes didn't mention it. But anyway, a sizable number of people. And a publication range that spans most of the time that biotechnology has been commercialized. Now, interestingly, most of this research that I've found has been published after 2019. This sort of fall off here is more with my selection criteria being a bit stricter because the same studies and the same findings keep getting published, so I'm looking for new things. But as we've gotten more cunning at modifying genes and the capacity for us to make new technologies improved, people have become really interested in understanding how those technologies are going to be perceived as they're released. So there has been a huge spike in sort of the public perception research. So this is a cross-section of the sample I found, those 57 papers, based on the domains that they fall into. So as you can see, overwhelmingly, it's mostly agriculture and food. When it comes to the acceptability of biotechnology, it's basically all in this sector, most of that being within agriculture. So 5 of these 20 studies look specifically at animal applications. Animal applications of biotechnology are mostly within agriculture as well, and they're reviewed a lot less than other related forms of biotechnology. It's mostly plant and crop modifications as opposed to animals. So I will be drawing on examples from within agriculture in general when I'm sort of describing the reasoning mechanisms, but they're also appropriate to animal modifications, but I'll get into the specifics a little bit later. This general segment here was when a study looked at more than one application at a time, or they were sort of doing an overview on some theme that was consistent within the literature, like whether or not something was natural, or what naturalness means, or just comparing different disciplines. This human health segment, these are mostly reviews, so there is more than 5 single studies in this. Human health tends to be researched quite a little, like compared to the others. One of the reasons for that is that it's generally the most accepted area of biotechnology, and the reasons why that it's accepted and rejected are the most understood. So there's a little less research given to it compared to agriculture and food. But I'll get into that in a little bit. So we'll start with the bad news first about what causes people to dislike biotechnology. And this is generally across the spectrum. So I'll break this down one at a time. This is one of the loudest slides that I've got, so thank you for bearing with me. So overwhelmingly, the highest driver of negative perceptions was that they were perceived to pose some risk across the spectrum of biotechnology. Risk was conceived of differently between studies, but it was generally described as being a risk to human health or a risk to the environment. And this was mostly the case in agriculture. I think like 3/4 of all the papers, that people overwhelmingly said that that was the biggest thing that turned them off. The next two were highly related to one another. The second was affective reasoning. Affective being reasoning on the basis of emotion and intuition, as opposed to logical factual information. Interestingly, human health is missing from here, and a reason that I'll explain in just a moment. But yes, that's closely related to the next one, which was having low objective knowledge of the topic of biotechnology. People had generally never heard of the term biotechnology or synthetic biology before they were asked their opinion. And if they were aware of the technology, like genetic modification or all that, they'd understand that it exists, but they wouldn't really know what it is or why you do it. And this caused a bit of a feedback loop between these two, which is that people would only have their gut reactions to rely on. And that would generally cause them to form a negative opinion in the absence of any understanding of how it worked. I've used the term objective here because some studies would ask people, what do you think you know? And some studies would test what people actually knew, there's a huge difference there. But anyway, perceived unnaturalness sort of followed under that. We will unpack naturalness later. It was one of the most common stated objections to biotechnology. So when it was expressed that people didn't like biotechnology, or you asked them why they considered it to be risky, it was very commonly the case that people would just say that it is unnatural. Some studies would say, do you think it's unnatural, and lead with that? Others would say, how do you feel about it? And people would volunteer the word unnatural. So it was quite heavily related. Distrust of information sources followed after this very closely, which was basically to say that there were some people that just didn't believe that the creators of a particular biotechnology were well-intentioned, or that they had carefully considered the risks, or that it was going to be used for some nefarious purpose. So it was a general rejection of the information about how it's safe and how it's helpful. Lack of benefits followed on after that, which was also related to a lack of knowledge, which is really that if you didn't understand why a biotechnology needed to exist, it was hard to appreciate its benefits. Interestingly, human health is not here. Everyone was able to intuit why you would cure diseases with biotechnology, but I'll elaborate on that when I get to the summary. And then the last two were discussed in neophobia. These two were kind of used interchangeably, but they are distinct concepts, and they mostly related to when you had to eat the product of a biotechnology. This is very much the case with cell-cultivated meat. People found the idea of animal meat that didn't come from an animal pretty disturbing. And I guess when you were genetically modifying livestock or crops, it evoked like these feelings of disgust and aversion. So that's a big sort of a breakdown of the common objections people had. So we'll get to the good news. There's less of it, but it is still quite influential. So if risk was the highest driver of negative perceptions, benefits was the highest driver of positive perceptions. When people understood why you would genetically modify something or otherwise influence its genes, acceptance shot up quite a bit. This stands out from the rest quite significantly in an intuitive sort of a way, particularly within agriculture and food. In studies, whether or not it was because people already understood why you genetically modify something or as a treatment condition in the experiment, people were just more accepting when they realized that you can solve supply chain issues or the difficulty of growing in marginal environments or making foods more nutritious or last longer on shelves. The same goes for other disciplines. When you understood why you do it, people were more accepting of it. This was described as being related to trust quite a bit. Trust is a heuristic in the sense that you don't need to know how the biotechnology works to think that it's good if you believe that it's being made for the right reasons and made the right way. So if people believed that it was developed carefully and responsibly, and they accepted the information given to them by a source, scientists were the most trusted source of information globally, the acceptance increased. This also related to high objective knowledge. These two were basically neck and neck in terms of how much they processed. By the way, I should have clarified earlier, these numbers here are the number of studies in the sample that cited this as a reason, like any particular factor as a reason for acceptance or rejection. People that were aware of how long it takes to develop something, like scientifically, and get it commercialized, the amount of testing, just the general idea that scientists are trying to solve problems by creating biotechnology, or biotechnology in general exists to solve problems. That sort of a thing was encapsulated in high objective knowledge, and it was a consistent factor of support. And the last was positive framing, which is to say that when information was provided about a biotechnology, it emphasized the benefits, it gave it a balanced accounting of the risks, it sort of put people's minds at ease about why you would do this and that it's actually safe, and it would do so in accessible language. So that sort of thing. So to summarize, oh, actually, no, wait, before then, this is from one of my favorite studies in the review that was published in Nature Behavioral Science that sort of gives a general overview of how people tend to form a negative judgment, or the ways that people reason when they do form a negative judgment, and then how entrenched that judgment becomes. So the more extreme people hold a belief against biotechnology, the more they dislike it, this dot dash line, the more likely they are to believe they know how it works or what it is. So their self-assessed knowledge is very high. But in these cases, it also tends to be the case that they actually possess the lowest understanding of how it, it really works. So the implication of this study and studies like it are the people that are in the greatest need of an educational intervention are the least receptive to them. Because if you provide people that already believe they know how it works and have an entrenched opinion with new information, they tend to reject it because the basis of their belief might not necessarily be factual. This remains sort of an open question in the literature about how you reach people like this, but we'll get onto that in a little bit. We can at least understand how this happens. So to summarize the general perceptions, because there was a lot of information all at once, the public is generally unaware of biotechnology, the term biotechnology, the discipline, or if they are aware of it, they have very little knowledge about it, which means that they tend to rely, the public in general, on their intuitions and emotions when it comes to evaluating how they feel about the technology. We may not always have access to factual information, but we've always got access to our gut reaction and our intuition and our emotion. And even if you have knowledge about something, you can have an emotional reaction to it. So this is the environment within which a lot of attitudes towards biotechnology are formed, generally across the board, animals included. Following on from that, when people use affective reasoning, like this gut reaction, intuition sort of judgment, in the absence of a factual understanding, they tend to come away thinking that it poses a greater risk to humans and environment than it actually does. So these gut reactions tend to be negative. We are feeling creatures first and thinking creatures second. If something feels like it's wrong, that can be interpreted as evidence that it is wrong, which we very creatively named the risk is feelings bias in behavioral science. So if you have a bad gut reaction about something, that can be very convincing, which is why the deficit model doesn't really work in this case as well as others, because it's hard to argue against how bad something feels. If you've ever gone skydiving, you can look at statistically how safe it is to do it. But then when you're actually faced with the prospect of falling out of a plane, it's very difficult to convince yourself of that safety. And it's sort of the same here, but to a lesser extent. And then lastly, which is a consistent finding across applications, the more intuitable and tangible the benefits of a biotechnology are, the greater the level of acceptance. And this is particularly the case for human health applications, because you don't really need to explain to somebody why it's good to try and cure genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophy. People can just understand what that's like by merit of having health. Whereas it's quite difficult to explain to people why you'd immunize livestock, because people may not even realize that that happens anyway. And they might not be aware that that issue exists. So it becomes a little difficult to sort of convince people. But we can drill down a little bit deeper into how benefits and perceptions work by looking at animal applications. Because these exemplify a lot of those reasoning processes a little more thoroughly. So these are the three major categories. I will elaborate on these in a little bit. The three major categories of biotechnology that's been researched within the public perception domain with animals. There is also gene drives for pest control, but I'll sort of bring that up later as a point. But we'll start with disease resilience. So these are some of the diseases. I thought about adding citations here, but this would have become a very cluttered slide. The public acceptability of genetically modifying cattle and pigs to become resilient to these diseases has been studied. These are just some examples. It isn't, interestingly, like they're not looking at immunizations that provide a resistance to these diseases. These studies were looking at, were it possible to genetically modify this animal to be resistant? How acceptable would you find that? With the African swine fever example, it was how willing would you be to consume an animal product from an animal that had been genetically modified to be resistant to these diseases? So a lot of the research into general acceptability of biotechnology can be prospective, which is to say the technology doesn't exist yet. The people are asking, how would you feel about it if it did exist? And that's the case here. It's also what I'm doing in my thesis, but I'll get onto that in a little bit. The general improvements, people, all authors tended to call this just improvements, like these general ones, like removing the horns from dairy cattle rather than surgically removing them, genetically modifying the animals so that they weren't born with them, producing allergen-free milk rather than having to formulate it, outside of a cow. And then there are several swine improvements. Cows and pigs tended to be focused on in the literature, particularly within China with pigs, because of how much of the diet of the Chinese demographic consists of pig meat. The EnviroPig, though, was actually real. This was a project that was looking at genetically modifying Yorkshire pigs so that they could digest phosphorus with a little more ease for environmental purposes and also just to save on food costs. But the funding was cut before it was finished because it was very difficult to sort of drive up incentive to continue funding the project. And then lastly was increased productivity, which is to say that the animal grows to market size quicker, or it grows larger than it otherwise would and produces a greater meat yield. This also exists, Aqua Advantage salmon. This was the first genetically modified animal product for sale in the US. And it took 20 years to receive FDA approval. It was a really difficult sell, but eventually it worked. And it was a salmon that grew to market size in about half the time. So the layout of this slide is tactical because it's also the degrees to which each of these things are supported. All of these biotechnologies provide benefits in some way, and benefit is the greatest driver of acceptance, or perhaps the single greatest one. But not all benefits are viewed equally. So again, it was very easy to understand why you would genetically modify an animal to make it disease resilient, where it was sometimes difficult for people to appreciate why you would remove the horns from dairy cattle, because if you otherwise didn't know why you do this, it's hard to appreciate the benefit. It's so that they don't injure themselves, but anyway, it was hard for people to intuit these benefits. Last was increased production. They saw this as just unworthy as a reason to genetically modify an animal. Another reason for the middling support of these is because, like particularly with the hornless cattle example, people saw it as a way of enabling poor husbandry practice. They were like, well, rather than changing the way that we do dairy farming so that cows having horns isn't such a bad thing, why are we genetically modifying the cows to enable poor husbandry practices? Why are we not changing that? And that's common across other things, particularly in conservation, but I don't want to get off topic. Pardon me. The other example not depicted here, because it was just a bit cluttered, was gene drives, which is where you bias genetic inheritance to skew the birth rate of a pest species. That sort of fell into the middling category. People really liked the idea of reducing pest species numbers without poison, just ensuring that less members of that pest species were born. But they were really disincentivized by the idea of creating a genetic modification that was heritable, that the offspring of that animal would then pass on. And they would cite things like cane toads as an example of that. But anyway, just as an overview of animal biotechnology acceptance, as is generally the case, the acceptance of a biotechnology is particularly tied to how necessary people find it. But this is really the case when it comes to animals. So one distinction is that animals are sentient and can personally experience the benefits or the disadvantages of whatever modification is applied to them. This is in the case that an animal is directly modified itself. In terms of, say you were to create an immunization to provide a disease resistance to an animal, how people feel about that, I'm sorry to say that research doesn't really exist. There has been almost no focus put onto public acceptability of livestock immunization. I seek to change that in my thesis, but I'll get to that in a little bit. But yes, if it benefits the animal, and it's easily understandable why it benefits the animal, acceptance was improved. The other thing, though, is that if it doesn't benefit the animal, or it only benefits the producer, people tended to think that it was not worthy. So this was also the case with genetically modified crops in their first generation, which was generally to make them resistant to pesticides. People saw this as just enabling use of more pesticides, and they didn't necessarily consider that to be particularly beneficial. Even though it was beneficial to the producer, they didn't necessarily like it because of the follow-on effect that it had. The other thing, though, is that if you have a benefit that benefits the consumer, like apples that don't brown due to genetic modification, people are more accepting of that. But yes, it has to benefit the animal, and in some way the consumer, or just in general, something that the consumer holds dear, like disease resilience or the climate, like something like that. But then there's this last point down here, which is the acceptance of animal biotechnology is generally lower than other related biotechnologies. The little amount of animal biotechnology perception research that exists portrays it as consistently less acceptable than plant biotechnologies. And this tends to be articulated with that unnatural again, and then people just generally finding it riskier. So after all of that run-up, talking about animal biotechnologies, general biotechnology, we're left with 3 unanswered questions, which is, okay, so people haven't really ever heard of biotechnology before, and they have to trust their gut reaction to form an opinion about it. But why is it that this opinion tends to be negative? You can have positive gut reactions to things just as much as you can negative. What is it about biotechnology in all of its applications, but particularly within animal applications, that causes people to come away feeling like it's bad? The other thing is that some methods of biotechnology are viewed worse than others. And this is particularly the case with cisgenics and transgenics. That African swine fever study that I mentioned about consumer acceptability of eating the flesh of an animal that had been modified to be resistant to the disease. The authors said, okay, so we've achieved this in 2 ways. One is with cisgenics using pig genes, and one is with transgenics using genes other than the pig to achieve the same effect. And people consistently went for this one. They wanted it to be more natural, quote unquote, and less transgenic. And then lastly, why is animal biotechnology viewed worse than plant-based, which is the closest comparison, because they're both in agriculture mostly? So the answer to these first 2 questions sort of answer this last one to an extent. So we're going to start with the unnaturalness objection, because that's the most common articulated objection when you ask people why. So unnaturalness has been used to mean a variety of things in the literature, primarily whether or not humans have interfered with it, which is a categorical distinction, and the degree to which humans have interfered with it. People can just say, well, it should be like this, and the fact that it isn't as bad, which is affective. People believing that there is a natural order to the world and that nature is sacred, things have a purpose, and if you change their purpose through genetic modification, it's somehow immoral or wrong. And the last one being that it's just different and unfamiliar, which sort of tied into that neophobia objection. There's only one of these which is really used consistently, which is how much it's been interfered with by humans. I mean, it's kind of inconsistent, because there was one study that asked people, how do you feel about domestication? And they're like, oh, it's perfectly natural. But it's generations of human interference, extensive genotype and phenotype changes, and yet it's considered natural. But the big thing that triggers this one is that if you create something that is not otherwise possible in nature, when that happens, that's when you see the largest degree of perceived unnaturalness. Now, these 3 quotes all make the same point, and they're from 3 studies. I actually had a chat with an author of this study. He's based at the University of Queensland. And the argument is, emerging across the literature, that people feel that gut reaction first. It precedes the feeling of unnaturalness, that gut reaction being disgust and fear. And then they use the word unnatural to justify the feeling of wrongness. So it's not so much that people feel, oh, it's unnatural, and then they think it's risky, and then they have a bad affective reaction. They have that bad gut reaction and then use the term unnatural to describe it. So the last layer to sort of unpick is, why is it that people tend to get this disgust and fear response when it comes to biotechnology, particularly when you're doing something that otherwise isn't found in nature? So brace yourselves, there's a bit of psychology here. I mean, probably the most psychological part of this. There are 2 ancient concepts that appear consistently throughout the literature, but have sort of recently been focused on, called psychological essentialism, which has 2 parts. The first is that the idea of psychological essentialism is that things have an intangible, almost magical essence that makes them what they are, and that this essence, through the law of contagion, can be transferred permanently through contact. Now, these intuitions are from our evolutionary context. We've always needed to eat, bear with me, but we've not always had the germ theory of disease. And so we've developed powerful intuitions to determine what is and isn't safe to consume. So like an example of this is if a cockroach scuttles over a piece of food, even if the contact is for a second, you're probably not going to want to eat that food because the essence of that cockroach has contaminated the cake. And this has worked well enough, like historically, that we've just sort of been left with it in the modern age. But what does this mean for biotechnology? Or what does this have to do with biotechnology? This phenomena of essentialism is seen elsewhere. So here are some examples. These are all been experimentally proven in different studies, but again, I would have cluttered with references. Please let me know if you want references to anything. I'll be happy to send them. It's the same reason, essentialism, that people are averse to staying in a room where someone has died, even if there's no threat in that room, because the room has been essentialized by the fact that somebody, left this world in it. The same, which is a bit amusing, is that people won't want to wear the shirt of somebody they don't like, even if it's been cleaned, because it's seen as being essentialized by having been worn by that person that they didn't like. Now, more related to what we're talking about, people prefer natural vanilla over synthetic vanilla, even though they're the same molecule. 99% of the world's vanilla is synthetic. It's synthesized from a petrochemical precursor mostly. And yet, people will prefer the natural one, even though they're chemically identical. And lastly, wild-caught fish are preferred over land-caught fish, even if they're the same size and species and effectively identical, because the provenance of that fish has essentialized it with some characteristic that is intangible, which makes it more appealing. This is also a driving reason for homeopathy. Like, I don't want to throw shade on homeopathy, like out of nowhere, but that's kind of the idea that you can get something to undergo a process and then it is changed by that process. Okay, so back on topic, what does this have to do with biotechnology and how does this phenomena appear in biotechnology? Well, Sweeney 5 years ago was the first person to sort of demonstrate that it's apparent here as well, which is that when you delete the gene from an animal, or just you perform a modification through genetic deletion, that's seen more favorably than cisgenics, transferring genetic material from an animal to another. So the same species to another. That is seen more favorably than when you do transgenics, which is a great, from a different kingdom or a different species. But if you were to make a new to nature gene that's made by humans that isn't in nature, that's seen more favorably than transgenics. And in this study, she basically posited that this is because the human gene is not seen as being essentialized. It comes from nowhere, and so it isn't seen as providing a greater level of contamination as transgenics. So like if you can imagine modifying a tomato with a catfish gene, for example, just, a completely unrelated random example, to make it frost resistant, evidence of essentialism would be that people would think that that tomato then tastes like fish, which is exactly what happened in 2004 when people thought that tomatoes modified with catfish genes would taste like fish, because they saw the essence of that tomato having been changed. The host was changed by a gene from a source, and the contamination effect was sort of present there. Lastly, to sort of round off this as the underlying reason for a lot of like the unnaturalness objection, is that when you introduce a foreign gene, which is to say a transgenic gene, into anything, perceived unnaturalness increases by a huge amount. But it doesn't decrease any more, no matter how many more genes you add, so long as they're from the same source, because the contamination's already occurred. But if you start adding genes from different sources, then perceived unnaturalness drops even further. So by violating this, just to summarize this, by violating the purity of something, by contaminating it through genes being a stand-in to essence, unnaturalness tends to be sort of described as the objection, to that process. And disturbing something's purity is a really strong way of evoking feelings of disgust in people, which is also why that sort of comes about with, objections to when you have to eat the product of a biotechnology. But what's interesting is that the regions of the brain that are responsible for feeling physiological disgust are also the same regions of the brain that are responsible for moral disgust. So when you contaminate something through this essentialist reasoning in the context of biotechnology, people can perceive that as being wrong and immoral in a way that's difficult to put into words, but the term unnatural seems to be the best way to describe the activation of this ancient reasoning mechanism that's a remnant of our evolutionary history. So this is just to conclude everything that I've said about biotechnology perceptions with the emphasis on benefits. The benefits, if they're going to positively affect positive perception of the public, it's a bit of a tongue twister, they have to be easily understandable and intuitive, and they have to outweigh the largely effective evaluation of risk. So it's a risk and benefit trade-off, but unfortunately in biotechnology, there are just more things that make it likely for people to perceive them as having a high degree of risk than a high degree of benefit. And this is the things that I've gone over so far. But if they have a positive effect on the consumer or the host, they're likely to be perceived positively. Also, the degree of implied essence change with that reasoning mechanism I just described is poorly correlated with rates of rejection. So the greater taxonomic distance between the source of a gene and its host, the greater the degree of unnatural, or the perceived unnaturalness. Now, this is a concluding remark before I move on to my research, and I'll quickly go through that. This is also from the Elderman Trust Barometer. You might recognize the layout, but this is from that same sample that really didn't like biotechnology in genetically modified foods. Although among individuals who believe that they've been effectively evaluated by scientists and ethicists, and that they've been effectively regulated, the level of acceptance goes from outright rejection to being okay with it. Now, the funny thing is that this happens, like it's not a fast and loose process, commercializing a genetic modification, testing it, designing it, but the public doesn't necessarily know the process that these technologies undergo. So it highlights not only the importance of responsible innovation of these technologies, but not outright dismissing people's objections to them, even if they're based on irrational beliefs or essentialist reasoning. If we can understand why people hold these opinions and sort of meet them where they're at, it's a greater pathway to acceptance. There was a study published by a colleague of mine, Lucy Carter, on naturalness that sort of looked at this topic. And sometimes people will have very legitimate concerns about, are they safe? How do I know that they're okay? Is this done for the right reason? Embedded within these unnaturalness objections. But anyway, that's just to highlight that it's important to sort of look through them and review them. So now we're moving on. I'll try and get through this quickly so I don't keep everyone past 5 o'clock on a first day about my project. So this is my crack team of supervisors at the Western Australian University, and Aditi being my industry supervisor. I've worked with her at CSIRO the longest. And I'm looking at public acceptability of livestock mRNA vaccines, like specifically. This is my main focus, but I'm also looking at plastic degrading enzymes, which are produced by genetically modified bacteria, and carbon capturing microorganisms. So research has not really been done on the public acceptability of any of these technologies. There was one case study conducted last year that was looking at plastic degrading enzymes by Henry Dixon. I got in touch with him developing the questions of these in the survey. I'm surveying public attitudes, by the way. I should have probably started by that, within Australia. I have funding graciously from the Immune Resilience and Advanced Engineering Biology Futures platforms to do this. I would have just done this, but I'm also fortunate enough to be a recipient of the Western Australian Agricultural Research Collaboration's scholarship, which has given me connections to industry representatives and regulators, so I can see how these segments of the value chain also consider livestock mRNA vaccines. And that hasn't really been researched either. It's mainly just been attitudes towards the public that have been looked at. So after all of what I've described, these predictors and outcomes shouldn't be a mystery. They've all been based from the literature review. A lot of these measures have been lifted directly from the studies that I've gone through the results of. And it's sort of to get an idea based on everything that I've said and all of the concepts that I've gone over, why I expect people to have certain responses, or what concepts I expect to be related to one another. I'm assuming that people have never heard of these biotechnologies before. They'll be using their emotions to evaluate with them. Moral purity, which is the same scale that Sweeney used, will be highly influential. And this is ultimately to determine what the outcome will be. Will I think it's acceptable? Will they want to engage with the products of these particular biotechnologies? So this pilot data that I'll run through very quickly, it'll be a bunch of charts. It's from 100 UWA undergraduates. The average age is 19. It's a very homogeneous sample. I also need about 100 more people to do a factor analysis or a linear regression. So this is just basically going to be descriptive early days research, but I'm soon going to deploy the survey nationally. So, as I expected, mRNA is this light blue one, the CSIRO blue. Carbon capture microorganisms is dark gray. For wherever you see this, it'll be the same. Plastic degrading enzymes is gray. People had never really heard of these biotechnologies before. This was, I know everything about them, I'm an expert, I've never heard of them before. mRNA was the highest awareness, which isn't saying particularly much, but still. And this was largely due to COVID making people aware of mRNA vaccines in humans. And motivation, which is to say, how important did people consider the issue to be? How important was it to solve livestock disease through mRNA? People read a description of each of these technologies and why they exist. And they were all considered to be very beneficial. Plastic degrading enzymes the most. Unfortunately, mRNA vaccines the least, probably because people weren't particularly aware of disease resistance specifically, or the fact that you vaccinate livestock. But anyway, these are the emotions that were felt. Overwhelmingly, happiness within this sample. People were quite accepting of them. They thought they were great. Relaxation was sort of, if people were feeling nothing in particular, they would sort of wait onto this. So people were very chill about mRNA vaccines for livestock. They also had the lowest level of anxiety relative to the other two regarding them. So it was mostly positive emotions felt, despite this scale mostly consisting of negative emotions. There was one person that just felt rage, but they're an outlier, interestingly, and low levels of disgust, although the highest among the different technologies, probably due to that essentialism reasoning. So risk and benefit perception. This is just raw. Do you think it's beneficial? Very homogeneous. People thought that they were quite beneficial. This is absolutely amazingly beneficial. This is not at all. Plastic pollution was a much more salient issue, so people were more accepting of that and carbon capture. But risk was also perceived as quite low to humans, the environment, and just general level of concern. This was specifically regarding mRNA vaccines. So this is extreme risk. This is no risk. So it was pretty balanced in terms of people considering it to be all right. I got people to rank the benefits. So I came up with 4 benefits based on conversations I've had with people in the IRFSP and just looking around the literature. So boosting livestock production, consistent with the findings of the literature, was the lowest. These numbers, there were 4 choices, and this is just the average of which was ranked first, highest being most. These 3 benefits were basically the same. This one just edged out, which was protecting against future pandemics, because people had generally heard about mRNA vaccines from the COVID pandemic. Improving animal welfare came second, but again, there's negligible difference. People just thought it was fine, but again, that was consistent with the literature. And improving the stability of supply chains. Now, interestingly, these two, as pointed out to me recently, are very similar. Improving supply chain stability and production are very related. So the framing effect is kind of at work here, depending on how it is you describe what the benefit of the biotechnology is. But moving on from that, this is the level of acceptance and trust towards each biotechnology. This is raw acceptance, which is to say, do you think it's appropriate to do this? And people would say, generally, yes, it's mostly appropriate. I also asked people, would you prefer an alternative to solving these problems like livestock disease resilience, plastic degrading enzymes, and environmental pollution that didn't involve biotechnology? There was slightly more support, well, like less, it's a bit, the scaling is a bit strange, but there was slightly less support for a biotechnology-based solution to disease resilience in animals, but not significantly different from the others with a high level of acceptance. And then overall, this levels of trust, which was quite high among this sample, mostly trust towards scientists and lowest in companies. So this quickly is behavioral intention. I asked a series of questions about, this is also specifically related to mRNA vaccines. Sorry if I'm ripping through this, please feel free to ask questions afterwards. So I asked people how willing they were to buy animal food products that had been immunized with specifically mRNA vaccines for livestock. And people were quite willing. This sort of gap here is the mostly willing. This is completely willing. This is mostly willing. I also asked them how willing they would be to buy non-food products like leather clothing from animals that had received mRNA vaccines. And they were equally willing, which makes sense within this sample because they scored very low on moral purity. And I mean that in the best possible way. It is not a judgment. And they had low disgust sensitivity. So it tracks that they wouldn't specifically see an objection to these two things. They were slightly less willing, though, to feed their pets animal products that had received mRNA vaccines, although it still falls in this category. It'll be interesting to see how this levels out over a national sample. I asked people how willing they were to personally receive an mRNA vaccine for a disease that has alternative vaccines available. So say you had a choice of, disabled single cell infectious or live attenuated virus and an mRNA vaccine, which would you pick? People were slightly less willing to pick the mRNA variant, but if there were a disease for which there were no alternatives, you could only have an mRNA vaccine, people were more accepting. It fell into the next category of acceptance. And this tracks with public acceptability of biotechnology in human health, the trade-off there being the severity of the disease versus the availability of other treatments. And that's consistent here. But again, the overall willingness was quite high, as well as the level of acceptance and the level of motivation. So within this sample, very accepting of all biotechnologies, quite accepting of mRNA vaccines. But that is counterbalanced by the expectation of regulators. This was from that Fernbach study where it had that graph. I used their same measure, and I have annotated this one, which is that even though there was a high degree of acceptance, there were still strict expectations of regulators. People were very supportive, sixes, completely supportive, this was sort of mostly supportive, of people adding extra regulations to these technologies. With mRNA vaccines more than the others, subjecting them to strict and thorough testing, labeling products so that people could identify whether or not they had been a product of biotechnology or that they were biotechnology. People were slightly in favor of forbidding imports. They preferred domestic manufacture over importing. Well, this is also truest with carbon capturing microorganisms. And then I added this one, which is the roundhouse, should the sale be forbidden entirely? So this is indifferent. It's not necessarily because, there's a graph here that people were accepting of it. Very slight support for like completely outlining it. And this was mostly people just, that hated it. There were people among the sample that just really didn't like them, but it was mostly acceptable. So I interpret this to be the high degree of acceptance that was experienced towards these biotechnologies by this segment was due to the fact that they believed that they were strictly regulated and controlled. So they don't want prohibition, but they do want regulation, and their acceptance is contingent on that responsible development, which was sort of echoed by the last year's Element Trust Barometer. So this very quick rack up, as I nearly run out of time, is that within the sample, people cared far more about the solution, the issue being solved rather than how it was being solved. They cared more about diseases being treated than they did how they were treated, or more about plastic waste being dissolved rather than how it was dissolved, that sort of a thing. They were very accepting of science and technology, so there was low vaccine hesitancy among the sample. They perceived it to have a low degree of risk, trusting of information sources, everything that we saw in the literature review. And lastly, the objections that did exist were not on the basis of purity. People had a very low sense of moral purity. Again, this is not an insult. And it wasn't really reflected. It didn't factor as much as it has in previous research, because it wasn't such a big deal. So I'm hoping, summarize all of that in the research that I'm doing when I scale this up, that by understanding the basis of objection, before these technologies are released, I can help influence their deployment. Whatever I learn from this can be factored into the deployment of these technologies. By consulting with the public and different people along a value chain, I can get a better idea of what people's specific concerns are, and I suppose the unmet needs that could be addressed by integrating these concerns into the development of these technologies. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your attention. I have a few people to thank. Firstly, Aditi, Lucy, and Liz from the AEB FSP. They were the ones that contracted me originally to conduct this literature review, and it's really what started me off on this whole journey. Christy for inviting me to speak, ACDP for hosting me, WAARC for awarding me their scholarship, which has enabled me to conduct research at this scope and scale, and both the Immune Resilience and Advanced Engineering Biology Future Science platforms for the funding that they've provided me, inviting me to speak at their conferences. I'm very grateful. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. As Annalisa said, feel free to pop your hand up if you want to ask a question. I saw one and then it's vanished. Did anyone see where?
No worries. I apologize also if I was just looking at my slides, so all of that. So if people were putting things in the chat or telling me to do something, I didn't see it. Sorry.
Nagendra?
Thanks. Nice presentation, Darcy. Nice work. Did any of the surveys consider the organizations that produce that product, like that influence the response in a certain way?
Yes, they did. So the source of the information was generally, so the source of the information, when somebody, I'm trying to think of a specific example to give you, but the answer is yes, and it was influential. If it was a university or a research institution developing the technology, that tended to be trusted more and people were more accepting of it coming from that source. Whereas if it were a private company developing a biotechnology, people were less accepting. So yes, the source, the individual or entity that was developing it was influential. It was dependent on the amount of trust, though, more than anything else.
Thank you.
I've got one. With your survey, how you said about labeling of products and people wanted that, was that labeling of like messenger RNA vaccines or labeling of a meat saying it had been vaccinated with a messenger RNA vaccine?
It was the product, yeah. But like,
Yeah.
people were accepting of product. What's interesting is that this has, like, product labeling has been researched, not necessarily related to vaccines, but if you give somebody the option of saying, would you like to know whether or not this has been vaccinated, or would you like to know that this has been subjected to some treatment, people are generally insistent that yes, I would like that. But it's an interesting sort of dichotomy in the sense that people aren't really aware that livestock is vaccinated anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you were to label existing products, this has been vaccinated with all of this, that would probably change their acceptance, because, you know, it would evoke a lot of the same mechanisms that I thought. But yes, it's just in terms of what people would think would make them secure. And the question's really asking, would you rather be aware that this is occurring? Like in Europe, when the objections to biotechnology really kicked off, a commonly cited reason was people weren't aware that genetically modified foods, when they first became commercialized, were being sold.
Yep.
And so they were like, well, we would have liked to have some input on this, but we didn't. And yeah, anyway.
Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to say, firstly, actually, a really good talk. I thought you did a great job setting
Thank
up
you.
the kind of the problem, especially to an audience who may not be so familiar with it. I was just sort of, at the end, you said something about community consultation. Is that a sort of future directions thing, or are you planning to do any of that in your PhD? Because it's something that a lot of so there's people in environment who are looking at, say, wind turbine or salmon farming projects and things, and as soon as you have like a big town hall meeting type thing, that is really a great way to actually not get
poison the world.
accepted.
No, okay, so the true answer to that question is I'm not planning to do any of that in my thesis. It is very much a next steps thing. But rather than just leave it at that, because a lot of studies will conclude by saying community consultation needs to be, the public need to be consulted on this, but then no one really suggests how that happens, or the implication of, you know, exactly the situation that you just brought up. When I work with farmers, they mention that exact same thing happening, where the same fine people would stand up and make the same points, and then no one else would say anything. Small scale focus groups, so Aditi's group, there are a few other researchers that I know that do small scale, how do you feel about this? And if it's a small, like, depending on how it's done, you can do it, but it's a big deal to do. So it's by no means a small thing. The point I was making at the end was sort of that if these concerns are just dismissed as being irrational and not addressed, then it creates far more problems than trying to sort of like get at the heart of why they occur. But it is definitely a complicated thing to do. So it's by no means easy, even if it's necessarily the right thing.
The same things come out with vaccines. For people to actually use themselves. If there's someone who's hesitant and you tell them they're an idiot, then that's a really great way to get them to become anti-vax. Because the people in the anti-vax side say, oh yeah, you know, they treat you nicely, and all the, you know, the pro-vax people, if they're being really nasty, then you just kind of get pushed into that group, and then you adopt their view.
I was an addictions counselor before I was a scientist, and something that we were trained to do is that if you're going to change anyone's mind on anything, you first have to say back to them a version of what they believe that they agree with. Because as soon as you've felt understood, then it sort of opens up. There's a technique, you can Google it, it's called deep canvassing, which is where you do that one-on-one sort of understanding. Well, why do you believe that? And I can understand why you believe that. What if you believe this instead? But that's not scalable. You can't do that on a national scale. But we've got an expert on vaccine research in the chat. I can see the hand up. G'day, Kerry.
Hey Darcy, how are you going? That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm really impressed with the survey and all the different domains that you're covering. And I have a question around, we're in, I guess, a bit of an era at the moment where there's a lot of politicization of science, and I know there's a lot of work in the human vaccine world that's trying to unpack that. But I'm wondering, are you looking at using any measures to try and incorporate that into the model that you built from your survey?
It's a good question. I am trying to understand, I can't make causal links with correlations, but I am trying to see the strength of the relationship between different factors on one another. So I'm explicitly measuring vaccine hesitancy in this research, as well as moral purity and conspiratorial ideation, a specific survey which has been adapted to detect rejection of information. So what I'm trying to see is, among people that are more inclined to believe in conspiracy theories, that are less trusting, that have less vaccine hesitancy, what else do you see? Like a lot of the findings that I've extracted, so that the long answer is I'm problem finding, I'm diagnosing as opposed to curing in this research. But the next step is to sort of go, well, how do you change people's minds afterwards? It is a really, there's no simple answer as far as I can see to solving that. And it's easier, like as I was sort of going through with the risk and benefits skewing, it's easier to get people's hackles up about biotechnology, and I suppose vaccines to an extent, than it is to convince them of their benefits. There's just more stacked against it in terms of people's reasoning inclination. So sorry to sort of say, yes, it sucks. But no, I'm very aware, and I'm trying to experimentally link different concepts together rather than piece them together. So like I've got a better idea of how to say what I was trying to do, sorry, which is that a lot of the research has said, oh, this seems to be related because different studies have found it. But the same study hasn't determined whether or not they're all linked together and hasn't done a linear regression. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to see, like, yeah, how are they experimentally connected to one another?
Just adding on to the, how do you connect with communities about these sorts of things? One method just that may be of interest that we've used in human vaccine rejection, like childhood vaccine rejection, are community juries. They've also been used for things like bat control and this kind of thing. And my colleague Chris Diegling down at University of Wollongong is an expert in those. So if anybody's interested, he's the guy to talk to for those.
I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
And we'll have one last question. Kirsty?
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation, Darcy. It just sort of occurred to me while you were talking about those different factors involved in kind of acceptability, I guess, of biotechnology, and I guess trying to make a bit of a link to whether or not there might be, sort of better acceptability of, say, for instance, vaccinated animals. I think you did talk about whether there was a perceived benefit to the animal. So, and I guess, my reading of, like a lot of the types of trials that we do as scientists are not necessarily kind of have that, that lens, I guess, attached to it. So, yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, like, is your sort of interpretation of that if there was some kind of framing that involved animal welfare, that may be better accepted?
I would 100% agree. Yes, I think based on everything that I've read and found, if you emphasize the benefit of animal welfare, you'll see a greater level of acceptance. Like, benefits are the highest driver of support that I've found, but they're not all considered equally. And it's easy to intuit the benefit of why you cure a disease in humans, like, because that. But like, there are plant diseases and you can genetically modify things to be resistant to those diseases in plants. But the plant benefiting from that specifically isn't as salient as an animal, like not having lumpy skin disease or, like bovine tuberculosis or something. Even if you don't necessarily know what diseases are being treated, the fact that, the animal isn't suffering because it's ill is very easily acceptable. Like, people can interpret that with great ease. And that's probably the biggest thing. Like, Benefit perception is really important generally, but it's particularly important with animals because only certain kinds of benefits tend to be accepted. And the consistent through line across all the research that I've found is that it benefits the animal.
Yeah,
got you.
Cool. Thanks.
I can see some questions in the chat.
Yeah, sorry.
We have time for that because it's past 5 o'clock now over there.
Maybe even if you've got thoughts, you can chuck in the chat because I know people probably. The chat will stay open, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. If you want to answer in the chat later, Darcy.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll just post my email address there if people want to email me.
I was going to say if it does close off and you can't access them, I'll gather them up and email them to you, Darcy.
Yep. There's a weirdly kerned version of my email.
Great.
Got you.
If everyone could just join me thanking Darcy so much. It was, fascinating. People blow my mind. Every time I think something makes sense, you said something else, and I was like, oh my goodness. So thank you for that. Thanks, Darcy.
Thank you all very much for having me. It's been a delight.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
See you later.
Thanks, Darcy. Thanks, Christy.